Annie Miles did not cry when she picked up her little brother and ran. She was 8 years old, her feet were bleeding, and she knew if she stopped moving, Silas Crowley would come back for them before sunrise. She did not know where she was going. She only knew one thing. Samuel was too weak to walk, and she was not going to leave him behind. If this story moves you, please subscribe and follow until the very last word, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1881 did not forgive weakness. Annie Miles had learned that early. She had learned it the way children in hard country always learn things, not from a book, not from a teacher, but from watching the adults around her do terrible things and call it survival. She was 8 years old and she was already tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She carried Samuel against her chest for the first half-mile. He was 4 and he had stopped being heavy to her weeks ago, not because he'd grown lighter, but because she'd grown harder. His legs hung loose. His head rested against her collarbone. He had not spoken since morning, and Annie had stopped trying to make him talk. Talking used energy. Energy was something they did not have to spare. The flour sack she'd wrapped around his waist was her own idea. She had seen it done once with a lamb that couldn't keep up with the flock. She figured what worked for a lamb might work for a little boy. It did not occur to her that she should not have to know things like that. The trail cut through the middle of a flat open stretch of Texas rangeland, and the sun was doing what the Texas sun always did in July. It pressed down like a hand trying to push everything in the world flat against the ground. Annie's feet had been bare since 2 days prior when she'd left her shoes behind without thinking, too focused on getting Samuel away from the smokehouse before Crowley came back. She didn't regret the shoes. She regretted a lot of things. The shoes weren't one of them. Annie. Samuel's voice was small, barely a thread of sound. I hear you. Are we lost? She kept walking. We're going forward. That ain't the same as lost. He was quiet again. She felt his fingers tighten on her shoulder just a little, and she shifted his weight and kept moving. The fence came out of nowhere, or maybe she had simply stopped seeing things that weren't directly in front of her feet. It was a working fence, solid post and wire, the kind a man puts up when he means to stay. She nearly walked into it. She stopped just in time, pressed her free hand against a post to steady herself, and stood there breathing hard. And then she heard him. Hey! The voice came from her left, not loud, not sharp, just a word dropped into the air like a stone into still water. She spun. Her arm tightened around Samuel. The man was on horseback, a big bay horse still as a statue. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she figured, though she wasn't always good with ages on men. Tan skin, dark hair under a worn hat, quiet eyes that didn't move fast. He wasn't reaching for anything. His hands rested open on the saddle horn. You need water, he said. Annie stared at him. Her jaw was set. Her feet were bleeding into the dirt, and she had not cried once, and she was not going to start now, not in front of a stranger who could take Samuel from her if he decided he wanted to. We're fine, she said. The man looked at Samuel. He looked back at her. No, he said simply. You ain't. It wasn't mean. It wasn't pitying. It was just honest, and Annie had been lied to so many times with kindness in the voice that honest hit her harder than she expected. Her chin wobbled. She locked it down. My brother's just tired, she said. We're going to the next town. Next town's 11 miles east, the man said. You know that. She didn't. She hadn't known that. She said nothing. He swung down from the horse in one clean motion and crouched down in front of her. Actually crouched, so his eyes were level with hers, not standing over her, the way men always stood when they wanted you to feel small. He kept a full arm's length of distance between them. He kept his hands where she could see them. My name's Elias Boone, he said. I own the land on the other side of this fence. I've got a well, and I've got a cabin, and I have got absolutely no interest in causing you any more trouble than you're already in. He paused. What's your name, miss? She looked at him for a long moment. Annie, she said finally. Annie Miles. And this is my brother Samuel. Elias looked at Samuel, who had raised his head just barely and was watching the stranger with eyes that were too dull for a 4-year-old's. He looked back at Annie. "Where's your mama, Annie?" And that was when the thing that had been locked behind Annie Miles's chest for 2 days, the fear and the fury and the weight of carrying everything alone, pushed so hard against her ribs that she almost couldn't get the words out. "Mr. Crowley locked her up," she said, "in the smokehouse, because she wouldn't sign the papers." Elias Boone went very still. "What papers?" "The papers that say we owe him everything. The papers that say he gets to keep us." Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that. "He said my brother wasn't worth feeding. He said I'd work off the debt by the time I was 12. She looked Elias straight in the eyes and said what she'd been holding since before dawn. "Please don't send us back. Please." Elias stood up slowly. He looked down the trail south the direction she'd come from, and his expression did something complicated that Annie couldn't name. Then he looked back at her. "I ain't sending you anywhere except to my well," he said. "Come on." She didn't trust him. She wanted to make that clear even to herself, even in her own mind. She didn't trust him, and she didn't know him, and she had learned from watching her mother that trusting men you didn't know was how you ended up locked in a smokehouse on a July night. But Samuel had not had water in 6 hours, and the next town was 11 miles away, and her feet were leaving red prints in the dirt. She followed him. The inside of Elias Boone's cabin was plain in a way that felt honest. No frills, no excess a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove that had been cleaned recent, a narrow cot against one wall. Annie stood in the doorway while Elias set Samuel down gentle on the cot, like the boy weighed nothing at all, and she watched Elias's hands the entire time. Watching hands was something she'd learned to do. Hands were where the truth lived. His hands were careful. That was all she could determine for certain. He brought water first. A tin cup, plain and dented, and he held it to Samuel's lips and tilted it slow. Samuel drank without opening his eyes. He drank like a small animal that had given up deciding whether to be afraid. "He needs more than water," Elias said. He wasn't looking at Annie when he said it. He was looking at Samuel, and his voice had gone flat in a way that she recognized. It was the voice of a person who was angry and had decided to be useful instead. "I know that," Annie said. She was still in the doorway. "You can come in," he said. "I ain't gonna do anything." "I know you probably think that's reassuring," she said. He looked at her then, and something shifted in his eyes. Not offense, not amusement, but something closer to recognition. "Fair enough," he said. He reached up to a high shelf and brought down a tin of dried beef and a small jar of honey. He set them on the table. "Food's there. Help yourself and your brother. I need to know how long ago Crowley locked your mother up, and I need to know exactly where." Annie watched him move to the door, watched him check outside before stepping back in, watched him pull his hat off and set it on the table peg with the calm deliberation of a man who was thinking hard. She sat down at the table. She pulled the tin toward her. "Yesterday afternoon," she said. "The smokehouse on Crowley's west side. It's got a padlock, but the hinges are on the outside." He looked at her again. "You know about hinges." "I know about a lot of things I shouldn't have to know." He didn't answer that right away. He looked at Samuel, then at her, then at the window. He picked up his hat again. "I'm going to ride out there and get her," he said. "You and Samuel are going to stay here with the door latched. Don't open it for anybody but me." "How will I know it's you?" "I'll knock 3 times and say Annie first. If it's anything different, don't open it." He paused at the door. "You got any reason to believe Crowley would come looking for you tonight?" She thought about it. "He'll look in the morning," she said. "He won't want to ride in the dark past the arroyo. His horses don't like the water sound." Elias absorbed that. He pulled his hat down and nodded once. "I'll be back before morning then," he said. And then he was gone. Annie did not sleep. She fed Samuel the dried beef in small pieces until he was strong enough to sit up on his own, and then she sat at the table with the lantern turned low, and she listened to the dark. Samuel fell asleep with one hand curled under his chin. His color was better. His breathing was easier. She watched him breathe and let herself feel for the first time in 2 days something that was almost close to relief. And then she felt guilty for feeling it because her mother was still locked in a smokehouse in the middle of July, and relief wasn't something Annie had earned yet. She pulled the scrap of paper from inside her dress. She'd taken it from Crowley's desk the same morning her mother had been locked up. She didn't fully understand what it said, but she understood that her mother's name was on it, and she understood that Crowley had written it himself, and she understood from the way her mother's face had gone white when she'd first seen it, that it was the kind of paper that could take everything from them. She folded it carefully. She put it back against her chest. She would know what to do with it when the time came. She didn't know how she knew that. She just did. Elias came back an hour before sunrise. He came back with her mother. Rebecca Miles was not what Annie expected after 2 days locked in summer heat. She expected broken. She expected the version of her mother that Crowley had been trying to build for 3 years. The one that was afraid of her own voice, that flinched at sudden movements, that apologized for taking up space. Instead, Rebecca Miles walked through the cabin door with her jaw set and her eyes burning, and the first thing she said was, "Where is Samuel?" "Here, Mama." Samuel's voice came from the cot, small and sleep-heavy, but real. Rebecca crossed the cabin in 4 steps and dropped to her knees and gathered him up, and she said nothing for a long moment. She just held him. She pressed her face into his hair. Her shoulders shook once, and then they stilled, and she pulled back and looked at him like she was counting every part of him to make sure it was all still there. Then she looked at Annie. "Come here," she said. Annie came. She let herself be held. She had not let herself be held in 2 days, because somebody had to stay hard, and she'd elected herself. But her mother's arms went around her, and her mother smelled like smoke and sweat, and something underneath all that. That was just her mother, and Annie Miles put her face against her mother's shoulder and did the one thing she had been refusing herself since she picked up Samuel and ran. She cried. It lasted 30 seconds. Then she straightened up and wiped her face and said, "I took something from Crowley's desk. I think it's important." Rebecca went still. "What did you take?" Annie pulled out the scrap of paper. Rebecca took it with shaking hands. She read it. Her face did something complicated and terrible and resolved. She looked up at Elias, who had stayed near the door, who had not moved or spoken since he brought Rebecca in, who was giving them the room in the way of a man who understood that some things had nothing to do with him. "This is my husband's homestead," Rebecca said. Her voice was quiet, the quietest kind of angry. Crowley didn't just want the children. He forged this debt to take the land too. Elias looked at the paper from across the room. "Is that your signature on it?" "No," she said. "It is not." A silence settled over the cabin. Outside, the first birds were starting up, which meant the sky was lightening, which meant they had hours, maybe less, before Crowley rode in with the sheriff. "Then we need to protect that paper," Elias said, "and we need to be smart about what we do next." He looked at Rebecca directly, not at the paper, not at the door, at her. "I ain't going to tell you what to do, ma'am. I want to be clear about that. But I can tell you what I know, and I can tell you that you don't have to figure this out alone, not tonight." Rebecca Miles looked at him for a long moment. She had learned across 3 years of Silas Crowley to read men quickly and read them accurate. She looked at this man who had ridden in the dark for her children, without being asked, who had crouched down to speak to her daughter eye to eye, who was standing near the door, instead of in the center of the room, who had his hat in his hands. She looked at him, and she decided. "All right," she said. "Tell me what you know." And in the small cabin, with the first gray light beginning to show at the window, and Samuel asleep on the cot, and Annie sitting straight-backed at the table with the scrap of paper held safe in her fist, Rebecca Miles listened, and Elias Boone talked. And the thing that Silas Crowley had not counted on, had never counted on. Because men like Crowley never did, began quietly in the dark to take shape. Elias told her everything he knew about Silas Crowley in the time it took the sky to go from black to gray. He told her that Crowley had been acquiring land in the county for 4 years, and that every acquisition followed the same pattern, a debt that appeared from nowhere, a signature that didn't match a judge who asked no questions. He told her that 2 families before the Miles had lost their homesteads the same way. One had left the territory entirely. The other, the Harmon family, had simply disappeared from public record, and nobody in town talked about them anymore the way people stop talking about things that make them feel ashamed. Rebecca sat at the table and listened without interrupting. Annie sat beside her and listened too, and Elias noticed that the girl had the same quality her mother had, that particular stillness that came not from passivity, but from paying very close attention. "You knew all this," Rebecca said when he finished, "and you didn't do anything." It wasn't an accusation, it was a question with a hard edge on it. "I didn't have anyone to do anything for," he said. "And I didn't have proof." "Now you do," Annie said. She held up the paper. Elias looked at the girl. "Now we do," he said. Rebecca pressed both hands flat on the table. "Crowley will come with the sheriff by mid-morning. He'll say I abandoned my children and that you're harboring stolen property, and by stolen property, he means me and my kids." She paused. "He's done it before. He had a woman in Greer County held for 3 days on a false abandonment claim until she signed whatever he put in front of her. He won't get 3 days with you," Elias said. "What makes you so certain?" "Because that woman in Greer County didn't have a forged ledger in her daughter's dress." Rebecca looked at him. Something in her face shifted, not trust, not yet, but the first crack in a wall she'd been building for 3 years straight. "We need to get to Martha Reed," she said. "Before Crowley does." Elias knew Martha. Everybody knew Martha. She'd run the dry goods store on the main street of Harlan Creek for 20 years, and she had the memory of a court reporter and the moral backbone of a circuit preacher. She'd been one of the few people in town who had looked Rebecca in the eye since Crowley had started his campaign to make her a social problem rather than a human being. "Martha's store opens at 7, he said. "Then we have 40 minutes, Rebecca said. She stood. She looked at Samuel still sleeping on the cot. She looked at Annie. Then she looked at Elias in that direct way she had, the way that made a man feel like he was being read chapter by chapter. "Why are you doing this?" The question sat in the air. Elias picked up his hat. "Because your daughter asked me not to send her back," he said. "And because I've been watching Crowley take things from people who couldn't fight him, and I'm tired of watching." "That's not a safe reason," she said. "No," he agreed. "It ain't." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she turned and gently touched Samuel's shoulder. The boy stirred, blinked, and looked up at her with the disoriented expression of a child who had woken up in a place his body remembered as safe before his mind caught up. "Mama," he said. "Right here," she said. "We're going on a walk, Bug. Can you walk for me?" Samuel nodded. He always nodded for her. Even half asleep and still weak, he always tried for her, and that small fact hit Elias somewhere in the chest that he hadn't expected. He looked away. He checked the door. Gee, Martha Reed was already unlocking her store when they came down the side road. She turned at the sound of footsteps, saw Rebecca, and her expression did something immediate and unguarded relief, followed fast by alarm, followed by the particular expression of a woman who had suspected the worst, and was grieving that she'd been right. "Rebecca Miles," she said. "Lord in heaven, what happened to your arms?" Rebecca had marks on both wrists from the rope Crowley had used to secure the smokehouse door from inside. She'd said nothing about them. She pulled her sleeves down now reflexively. "I need to tell you something, Martha," she said. "And I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." Martha looked at Elias. She looked at Annie, who was holding Samuel's hand, with the grip of someone who had decided she was not letting go of him again for any reason whatsoever. She looked back at Rebecca. "Come inside," she said. Rebecca talked for 15 minutes without stopping. She laid out 3 years of Crowley's control the way he'd arrived after her husband Thomas died, offering to help with the land management, inserting himself slowly until his name was on papers it had no business being on. The way he'd made himself indispensable to people in town, so that when he began saying things about Rebecca, that she was unstable, that she couldn't manage her children, that her grief had made her irrational, Those people believed him because they owed him, and it was easier to believe a creditor than to question him. Martha listened with her hands folded on the counter and her jaw tight. "He forged the debt note," Rebecca said. She laid Annie's paper on the counter. "This is my husband's handwriting imitated, badly. Thomas never wrote his sevens like that, and this signature is not mine." Martha looked at the paper for a long time. She looked up at Rebecca. "I knew something was wrong," she said. Her voice was low. "When he started telling people you'd left those children alone for days at a time, I knew. I've seen you with your children, but I didn't." She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "I didn't say anything. I'm ashamed of that." "You can say something now," Annie said. Both women looked at the girl. Annie was standing straight, Samuel's hand in hers, looking at Martha Reed with the expression of someone who had decided that 8 years old was old enough to say the true thing out loud. Martha looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Rebecca. "What do you need from me?" They had the outline of a plan before the church bell struck 8. It wasn't a complicated plan. Complicated plans had too many places to break. What they had was this: Martha would go to the 3 women she trusted most in Harlan Creek and tell them to come to the courthouse square at noon. Not to do anything, just to be there with their eyes open because something was going to happen and witnesses mattered. Rebecca would stay off the main road until they were ready. Elias would go to the telegraph office and send a message to the territorial marshal's office in Abilene. "They won't come in time," Rebecca said. "Crowley will move before a marshal can ride from Abilene." "I'm not asking them to come," Elias said. "I'm asking them to have a record. If Crowley does something to you in front of witnesses on a day we've already telegraphed the marshal's office, it becomes a federal matter before sundown." Rebecca absorbed this. "You've thought about this before," she said. "Not just today. You've been thinking about how to stop him." "I've been thinking about how someone could stop him," Elias said. "If they had the right evidence and the right timing. I just didn't have either one until your daughter walked up to my fence." Annie, who was feeding Samuel a piece of hard candy that Martha had pressed into her hand, looked up at this. She didn't say anything, but something in her expression eased just slightly, the way a person's face eases when they stop bracing for the impact that doesn't come. Then the door to Martha's store opened, and everything shifted. It was Deputy Cal Hughes, young, soft-faced, the kind of man who had chosen law enforcement because it came with a hat and a wage and had not yet been required to be brave. He stepped inside and looked at Rebecca like she was a problem he'd been assigned rather than a person he'd encountered. "Mrs. Miles," he said, "Mr. Crowley filed a report this morning. Says you abandoned your children and that a man named Boone took them without permission." "My children are standing right here, Deputy," Rebecca said. "Does that look like abandonment to you?" The deputy looked at Annie and Samuel. He looked back at his boots. "He says you left them alone on his property, and this man," he looked at Elias, "rode onto private land and removed them." "I removed myself," Annie said. Her voice was clear and precise. "I picked up my brother and walked away. Mr. Boone found us on the road." She paused. "Do you want to know why I left? I can tell you exactly why." The deputy looked at the 8-year-old girl and had the expression of a man who had not prepared for this encounter. "He said my brother wasn't worth feeding," Annie said. Those were his exact words. Mr. Crowley looked at Samuel and said he wasn't worth the food it would take to keep him alive. And then he locked my mother in the smokehouse because she told him he was wrong. Silence. Martha Reed spoke from behind the counter. "I'll be testifying to that deputy. Write it down." "Martha, write it down, Cal. I've known you since you were 7 years old, and I know your mother raised you better than this." The deputy's jaw moved. He took out his notepad. He wrote something down without reading it back to them. "Mr. Crowley is at the sheriff's office," he said finally. "He's asking for the children to be returned to his custody until the debt matter is settled in court." Rebecca stepped forward. One step, just one, but it was the kind of step that changed the air in a room. "Those children are not a debt instrument," she said. They are my children, and the debt itself is a forgery, and I will stand in the middle of the public square and say so in front of every person in this town if I have to." She looked the deputy straight in the face. "Tell Silas Crowley that Rebecca Miles is done being quiet." The deputy left. The door closed behind him. Martha let out a breath. "He'll tell Crowley everything," she said. "Good," Rebecca said. "I want him to." The morning moved fast after that, the kind of fast that happened when the thing you'd been fearing finally started moving toward you, and you realized that standing still was no longer an option. Elias went to the telegraph office. He kept his message short and factual. Forged land documents, 2 minor children threatened false sheriff's claim, requesting federal oversight. He paid for it with the last of the paper money in his vest pocket, and walked back into the street without looking at anyone who was looking at him, because there were several. Word traveled in Harlan Creek, the way word traveled in all small towns, instantly and distorted, and with everybody adding their own particular flavor to it. By the time Elias reached the edge of the main road, he could feel it the way people on the street had positioned themselves. Watching. Calculating. A few faces he recognized had already gone cold, which meant Crowley had already spoken to them. Already laid his version of events down like concrete before Rebecca's truth had a chance to set. He had expected this. He had grown up in a town like this, a town where the man with the most money had the longest reach and the deepest voice, and where the people who should have spoken up had learned by slow degrees that speaking up cost more than staying silent. What he had not expected was Crowley himself stepping off the boardwalk in front of the land office and walking directly toward him. Silas Crowley was a tall man, wide-shouldered, well-dressed for a working rancher, with the kind of face that had probably been considered handsome 20 years ago before the calculation in it became too visible. He walked like a man who had not been told no in a long time, and had started to forget it was a word that applied to him. "Boone," he said. Elias stopped. He did not reach for anything. He did not step back. "Crowley, you made a mistake this morning," Crowley said. His voice was conversational, almost friendly, which was more alarming than if he'd been angry. "Taking those children off my property. That's a criminal matter." "Is it?" Elias said. "The sheriff thinks so." "The sheriff thinks what you tell him to think," Elias said. "Which works fine until somebody with better information shows up." Crowley's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. Something went very flat and very focused. "You don't know what you've walked into," he said. "You're a cowhand with a fence line and a quiet reputation. Don't spend that reputation on a woman who's already been judged by this town." "Judged by who exactly?" Elias said. "By the people you put debts on, by the sheriff you bought." He tilted his head slightly. "By the judge whose name is in your ledger." The pause that followed was very small and very significant. "I don't know what you think you have," Crowley said. His voice had lost the conversational edge. "I know what I have," Elias said. "And so do you." Crowley took one step closer. Not threatening it was too public for threatening, but close enough to make the intent clear. "That woman and those children have got nowhere to go in this county that I can't reach," he said quietly. "You think you're protecting them. You're just making it worse." Elias looked at him. He looked at the man who had told a 4-year-old boy he wasn't worth feeding. He looked at the man who had locked a woman in a smokehouse in July and called it legal process. "I reckon we'll find out," he said. He stepped around Crowley and kept walking. He found Rebecca behind Martha's store where she'd stayed out of sight with the children. She knew immediately from his face that something had happened. "Crowley," she said, not a question. "He came to me directly," Elias said, "which means he's moving faster than I expected. He knows we have something on him, and he's trying to assess how much." "What did you tell him?" "Enough to rattle him." He looked at Annie, then back at Rebecca. "We need to talk about the ledger." "The paper I have isn't the ledger," Rebecca said. "It's one page, a fragment." "I know. The ledger's in his ranch office." He paused. "We need the full ledger. That one page proves your debt is forged. The full ledger proves what he's been doing for 4 years to every family in this valley. Rebecca went still. "You want to go into his office." "I want to have what we need before we stand in front of a judge," he said, "because that page alone Crowley will say it's stolen, manufactured your word against his. But the full ledger in his own hand with every forged signature and every stolen land claim going back 4 years is something a territorial marshal can act on." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. She looked at Martha, who had come to the back door of the store and was listening. "When?" Rebecca said. "Tonight," Elias said. "There's a storm coming in from the north. His men won't ride patrol in a hard storm." "You've watched his property." "I've been watching Crowley for 2 years," Elias said. "I just didn't have a reason to move until now." Rebecca looked at him. That reading look, the one that went through a man's stated words and checked what was underneath them. "You've been waiting," she said slowly. "You've been building toward this." "I've been hoping someone would come along who could finish it," he said. Someone Crowley had actually wronged on record. Someone with a forged document and enough courage to stand in public and say so. He met her eyes. "Your children walked up to my fence, Mrs. Miles. I didn't manufacture that." Something moved in Rebecca's face. It wasn't trust fully. She had learned what full trust cost. But it was close enough to trust that the distinction barely mattered. "All right," she said for the second time that day. "Tell me the plan." The afternoon was the hardest part. Not because anything dramatic happened, because nothing did, and the waiting was its own kind of violence. Rebecca sat in the back room of Martha's store with Samuel on her lap and Annie beside her, and she told her children a story about their father, about Thomas Miles, who had come to Texas from Tennessee with $40 and a letter of intent, and had built the homestead with his own hands, timber by timber, in the summer of 1874. Who had planted the cottonwood by the east fence because he said shade was a gift you planted for people who came after you. Who had died of a fever in the winter of 1879 and left his family a piece of land that was worth something and a deed that was clean and legal, and had never not once mentioned the name Silas Crowley. Annie listened with her hands folded. Samuel fell asleep during the part about the cottonwood. "Mama," Annie said when the story was done, "are we going to be okay?" Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "You don't know that." "No," Rebecca admitted. "But I'm going to act like I do, because the other option is giving up, and I have decided I'm not going to do that anymore." She looked at her daughter. "I was quiet for too long. I let him make me small because I thought small was safe. It wasn't. Small just made it easier for him to take things." Annie was quiet. Then, "I took the paper," she said. "Before you got locked up. I snuck into his office and I took it because I thought it was important." Rebecca looked at her daughter, at this 8-year-old girl who had stolen evidence from a corrupt rancher's desk, who had carried her brother 11 miles, who had looked a stranger in the face and asked not to be sent back, who had spoken to a deputy with the calm precision of someone 3 times her age. "I know you did," Rebecca said. "I know. Are you angry?" "I am so proud of you," Rebecca said, "that I don't have the right words for it." Annie leaned into her mother's side. Outside in the direction of Crowley's ranch, the sky had begun to darken. The storm was coming. Elias knocked on the back door just after supper, 3 times. Then, "Annie." The girl was up and to the door before Rebecca could move. The storm hit Crowley's ranch the way hard truth hits a man who's been lying too long fast, and without mercy and all at once. Elias had read the sky right. The rain started an hour after dark, not the slow kind that eases in and gives you time to prepare, but the driving kind that came down in flat sheets and turned the ground to mud before you'd finished pulling on your boots. Thunder rolled in from the northwest in long, low waves. Lightning split the sky every few minutes, bright enough to read by gone before you could use it. Rebecca had not wanted to come. That had been the argument that nearly undid the whole plan. "You stay with the children," Elias said. "Martha's watching them. You don't need to be there." "I need to be there," she said. "It's Crowley's property. If we're caught having me there or not, there doesn't change what he does to you," she said. "And I need to see it." I need to see the proof with my own eyes, so that when I stand in front of a judge, nobody can tell me I'm repeating something somebody else told me." She looked at him steadily. "I've been taking other people's word for my own life for 3 years. I'm done with that." He had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had handed her the extra oilskin without another word. Martha had taken the children to the room above her store. Annie had held Samuel's hand and looked at her mother in the doorway with an expression that was not fear, but something adjacent to it, the look of a girl who understood exactly what was at stake and had decided to trust the adults around her to handle it, which was perhaps the bravest thing she'd done yet. "3 knocks," Annie said. "Then your name." "3 knocks," Rebecca confirmed. "Then my name." She followed Elias into the dark. They came in from the east side of Crowley's ranch on foot, moving along the fence line where the ground was lower and the noise of the storm covered the sound of movement. Elias went first. Rebecca stayed a half step behind and to his left, and she moved well quiet, deliberate, with the economy of motion that came from years of working a homestead alone. He had not expected that. He kept noticing things about her that he had not expected, and he kept filing them away without examining them too closely, because this was not the moment for that. The ranch house was dark on the east side. 2 lights burned on the west, the bunkhouse where Crowley's men were riding out the storm. The main house had 1 lamp in the front room, which meant Crowley was there awake, which meant they needed to move through the office without making a sound. The office was accessed from a side door off the main building. Elias had been inside it once 2 years ago, when Crowley had invited half the county ranchers to a meeting about water rights and served whiskey and talked about community while simultaneously laying the groundwork for owning everything that community depended on. He had memorized the layout the way he memorized all things that might one day matter without appearing to, without letting Crowley see him do it. The lock on the side door was a standard pin tumbler. Elias had the door open in 40 seconds. Rebecca stepped inside after him and pulled the door closed against the rain. The office was black. Elias moved by memory. He kept his hand just above the desk surface without touching it, orienting himself, then reached for the lamp he'd seen on the desk 2 years ago. His fingers found the base. He struck a match, cupped the flame, turned the wick low. The light caught Rebecca's face, focused, intent, utterly without fear, in a way that had nothing to do with not being afraid, and everything to do with having made a decision. "Ledger," Elias said quietly. She was already moving to the filing cabinet. She'd asked him exactly where it was during the planning, and she'd listened the way she always listened, completely storing everything for later use. She pulled the second drawer. Her fingers walked the files, then stopped. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger and set it on the desk. They opened it together. The first page was dated 4 years back, January 1877. Rebecca read it fast, her finger moving down the columns without touching the page. Elias watched her face. He watched the moment she understood what she was looking at. Not just her own case, not just the forged debt note Annie had stolen, but the full architecture of what Crowley had built. Name after name after name. Debt amounts that appeared from nowhere. Land values transferred. Signatures that didn't match. A judge's initials in the margin repeated so many times they'd become almost decorative. "The Harmon family," she said. Her voice was barely a breath. "They didn't leave. He took their land in February of 1878, and the note says they were relocated." She looked up. "Elias, what does relocated mean in Crowley's ledger?" He had a bad feeling about what it meant. He didn't say so. "Keep reading." She turned pages. She found the Miles entry. Her husband's name, Thomas J. Miles written in Crowley's hand in the spring of 1880, a full year before Thomas died. The debt had been written before the death. Written in anticipation of it, as though Crowley had known or planned or both. Rebecca went very still. "He wrote this before Thomas died," she said. "I see it. He planned this before my husband was in the ground." Her voice was quiet in the way that a rope goes quiet right before it goes taut. "He had this ready. He was waiting." "Rebecca," "How did Thomas die?" she said, and her voice broke on the last word, not from grief, but from the specific terrible realization of someone who has just looked at a familiar thing and seen it for the first time differently. "He had a fever. He died in 3 days. He was 41 years old, and he died in 3 days from a fever in the middle of winter, and I never—" She pressed her hand flat on the page. "I never questioned it. I never once questioned it. Elias did not tell her she should have. He did not tell her it wasn't her fault. He said nothing, because this was the moment when words cost more than silence, and he understood that." She stood there for 10 seconds with her hand on the ledger. Then she straightened. She pulled out the page with her name on it, the original forgery, and laid it next to the corresponding entry in the ledger. They matched in Crowley's handwriting, differing only from her signature, and Thomas's, which were imitations good enough to fool a tired judge, but not a woman who'd watched her husband sign his name 10,000 times. "I need all of this," she said. "Every page that has a family's name." "We can't take the ledger. He'll know it's gone." "I know." She looked around the desk. "Paper. Give me paper." He found a stack in the top drawer. She sat down and began copying. Her handwriting was fast and clean. She'd been a schoolteacher before Thomas. He remembered her mentioning it, and the hand of a schoolteacher didn't forget its precision. She copied the key entries, the dates, the figures, the judge's initials. She copied the Harmon entry in full. She copied the entry about Thomas. Elias stood at the door, listening. 6 minutes passed. 7. She said, "I've got it." He turned. She was folding the papers with the efficiency of someone who had already decided exactly where they'd be kept and exactly what they'd be used for. Then the floor above them creaked. They both heard it. Both went still. Footsteps. Slow. Moving toward the stairs. Elias turned the lamp down without touching the flame, just reduced the wick until the light was almost nothing. A dim reddish glow barely enough to see by. Rebecca was already on her feet, papers inside her coat against her chest, not making a sound. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. Paused. A door opened. Not the office door, the kitchen adjacent to the hall. The sound of a cup being set down. Water being poured. Neither of them breathed. The footsteps returned to the stairs. Paused again at the landing, and in the pause Elias heard what he hadn't heard before, a second set of steps, lighter, coming from down the hall. "You're up late," Crowley's voice. From the hallway, maybe 20 feet from the office door. "Couldn't sleep." A voice Elias didn't recognize. Male. Not one of his regular hands. "The Boone situation is handled," Crowley said. "I need you in town by 6. Sheriff's going to bring the children over in the morning, and I want you there when the papers get signed." "What if the woman fights it?" A pause. "She won't," Crowley said. "She's got nowhere to go and no one left to go to. By tomorrow afternoon it's done." The second man said something too low to hear. Crowley laughed, a short, flat sound with no warmth in it, and then the footsteps moved away. A door closed. The house went quiet. Rebecca's hand found Elias's arm in the dark. Not for comfort, for communication. Her grip said now. He opened the side door. Rain hit them immediately, cold and hard. They moved along the fence line faster than they'd come, not running, but close to it. The lightning was more frequent now, which helped, and didn't help. It lit the ground ahead of them, but it lit everything else too. They were 30 yards from the fence line when the bunkhouse door opened. Elias pulled Rebecca down and to the left without thinking. They hit the ground behind a water trough. Not together, he kept a hand's width between them, even then, even instinctively. Voices from the bunkhouse. 2 men stepping out under the narrow shelter of the overhang, complaining about the rain. Rebecca did not move. She did not make a sound. She lay flat in the mud with 3 years' worth of evidence pressed against her chest. And she waited. And Elias had the thought, sudden and certain, that this woman had been surviving impossible things for so long that she'd gotten very, very good at it. The bunkhouse men went back inside. They moved. They reached the road in 20 minutes and the edge of Harlan Creek in 40. The storm was still driving hard. They were soaked through mud to the elbows, and Rebecca was shaking not from fear, but from cold, and the particular physical aftermath of sustained locked-down tension finally releasing. Elias pulled off the oilskin he'd kept over his saddlebag and handed it across. "I'm already wet," she said. "Take it anyway," he said. She took it. She wrapped it around her shoulders without looking at him. They walked in silence for a few minutes. Then she said, "He was in that house planning to take my children in the morning. He was standing 20 feet from where we were, and he thought it was already done." "It's not done," Elias said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." She paused. "He said you had been handled. What does that mean?" "It means he's talked to someone about me," Elias said. "Probably the sheriff. Maybe somebody else." He thought for a moment. "It means I shouldn't be the one standing in front of the judge tomorrow." She looked at him. "You should be the one standing there," he said. "You and Martha and whoever Martha's brought. The evidence stands on its own. It doesn't need me in front of it. But it does need you." He met her eyes. "Can you do that?" She was quiet for a moment. "After tonight," she said, "I can do anything." They reached Martha's store and came in through the back. Martha was awake. She was sitting at the back table with a lamp and a cup of tea that had gone cold, and she stood the moment she saw them. "God above," she said. "You got it." Rebecca pulled the papers from inside her coat. They were damp at the edges, but the writing was intact, clear, every word legible. She spread them on the table. Martha leaned over them. Her finger moved down the names. She reached the Harmon entry. She stopped. "Ben Harmon," she said quietly. "He came to me in the spring of '78. He was asking about lawyers. I told him I didn't know any in the county who weren't tied to Crowley." She looked up. Her voice had gone hollow. "I told him his best option was to settle." She pressed her lips together. "He left the county 2 months later. I always assumed he'd found somewhere better to go." The three of them stood around the table. "He hadn't found anywhere better," Rebecca said. "No," Martha said. "He hadn't." She straightened. Her expression had moved through grief and landed somewhere firm and decided. "What time is the marshal's office going to get your telegraph?" "First thing this morning," Elias said. "If they ride hard, they could be here by late afternoon." "Then we need to hold Crowley in public until late afternoon," Martha said. "We need to make it so that whatever he does it in front of every person in this town." "He's going to come with the sheriff," Rebecca said. "He's going to try to take the children before anyone can stop him." "He can try," Martha said. She turned and picked up her lamp. "I've got 4 women in this town who've been waiting for a reason to stand up. I'm going to go wake them up right now." She moved toward the door. "Martha," Rebecca said. The older woman paused. "Thank you," Rebecca said. Martha turned. She looked at Rebecca, at this woman who had been made small for 3 years by a man with more money than conscience, and she said, "Don't thank me. I should have done this 2 years ago." She opened the door. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow you're going to need every piece of yourself." She went out into the rain. Rebecca stood at the table with the papers in front of her. Elias stood across from her. The lamp between them threw equal light in both directions. "The entry about Thomas," she said. "The date." "I know. He was planning it while Thomas was still alive." She looked down at the papers. "I don't know what that means yet. I don't know if I can prove it means what I think it means. But I'm going to find out." "One thing at a time," Elias said. She looked up at him. "You said that like a man who has learned it the hard way." "I have," he said. A pause. Outside, the rain was beginning to soften, not stopping, but losing its fury the way storms did when they'd said what they came to say. "Your wife," Rebecca said. It wasn't quite a question. Elias was quiet for a moment. "Fever," he said. 1876. We'd been in Texas 8 months. "I'm sorry," she said. And she meant it in the particular way of someone who had also sat with that specific loss and understood its specific weight. "I know," he said. And he meant that too. They stood in the lamplight on opposite sides of the table, with the evidence of Crowley's crimes spread between them and the rain going quiet outside, and neither of them moved, and neither of them needed to, because some things don't require movement to be understood. Then Samuel cried out from upstairs, a small sleep-frightened sound, and Rebecca moved immediately, the moment breaking clean. Elias picked up the papers and folded them careful. He tucked them inside his vest against his own chest where they'd be dry. He stayed downstairs. He did not sleep. He sat at the table and listened to the rain finish its business with the Texas night. And he thought about the entry dated before Thomas Miles had died. And he thought about what kind of man plans a widow before she exists. And he thought about what tomorrow would require from every single one of them. At some point, Annie came downstairs. She didn't say anything. She just sat down across from him at the table, folded her hands the way her mother folded her hands, and looked at him with those eyes that had already seen too much. "Are we going to win?" she said. Elias looked at the girl who had started all of this by walking up to his fence and asking not to be sent back. "I think so," he said. "You think so?" she repeated. "That's not the same as yes." "No," he agreed. "It ain't." He looked at her steadily. "But your mama walked into a rainstorm tonight to get the proof to do it right. And Miss Martha is going to have half the women in this town standing on those courthouse steps by noon. And you—" He paused. "You stole the one piece of paper that showed us what we were looking for. All of that adds up to something, Annie." The girl was quiet for a moment. "What if the judge doesn't listen?" she said. "Then we make sure everyone in that square hears it anyway," Elias said. "Because Crowley's real power isn't in the judge. It's in the town believing he's untouchable. The moment the town sees him touched, that power is gone." Annie absorbed this. She sat with it the way she sat with everything, quietly, seriously turning it over. Then she nodded. Once. Decisive. She went back upstairs. Elias sat in the dark with the papers against his chest and the long, thin edge of dawn beginning to show at the bottom of the window. And he waited for morning with the particular patience of a man who has decided that whatever it costs, it will not be more than he can pay. Across town, in the best room of the Harlan Creek Hotel, Silas Crowley slept soundly, certain of tomorrow. He had made the mistake that powerful men always made. He had stopped watching the people he thought he'd already beaten. Dawn came in hard and bright after the storm, the way Texas mornings always did, like the night had never happened, like the world had been washed clean and had no memory of what it cost. Rebecca Miles had not slept. She had lain on the narrow cot in Martha's back room, with Samuel tucked against her side, and Annie curled at her back, and she had stared at the ceiling and made a list in her mind. Not of fears, not of what could go wrong. A list of what she knew to be true, stated plainly, one fact after another, because facts were the only thing Crowley had never been able to take from her, no matter how hard he tried. Fact, the debt was forged. Fact, her husband's name had been written into Crowley's ledger before Thomas Miles was in the ground. Fact, her daughter had walked 11 miles on bleeding feet and had not broken. Fact, she herself had gone into a man's office in the middle of a rainstorm and had come out with the proof. She lay there, and she said these things to herself quietly, like a woman counting her money before a hard purchase, making sure she had enough. She did. She had enough. By the time the church bell struck 7, she was dressed and standing at Martha's back window, with a cup of coffee going warm in her hands, watching the street come to life the way it always did, slowly, ordinarily, with no idea what the day was about to ask of it. Martha came in from the front. "They're here," she said. Rebecca turned. "All 4 of them," Martha said. "Clara Briggs, Hattie Morse, June Alderman, and Nell Foster. They're at Clara's house right now. They've been up since 5. She paused. "Nell brought her husband. He said he's been wanting to say something about Crowley for 2 years, and his wife finally gave him permission." Rebecca almost smiled at that. "And the telegraph," she said. Martha's expression shifted just slightly. "Elias went to check. The marshal's office received it. They sent a rider last night." She met Rebecca's eyes. "He could be here as early as midday. Crowley will move before midday." "I know," Martha said. "Which is why we need to be on those steps first." Elias came through the back door at 7:30. He had changed into dry clothes, and his face had the particular quality of someone who had processed the night's events and arrived at the other side of them with a clear head and a decided mind. He set his hat on the peg and looked at Rebecca. "Crowley's at the sheriff's office," he said. "He's been there since 6. The deputy who came to Martha's store yesterday, Hughes, he's been in and out twice already. Whatever Crowley's planning, he's moving it forward." "He wants the children before the marshal arrives," Rebecca said. "Yes." "Then we don't give him the opportunity." She set down her coffee cup. "We go to the courthouse steps now, all of us, before he can set up the story he wants to tell." Elias looked at her. "If we go now, we go without the marshal, without federal backing. It'll just be us, Martha, and 4 townswomen against the sheriff and whoever Crowley's brought." "5 townswomen," Rebecca said. "And 1 husband." She looked at him steadily. "And the truth, which is the one thing he doesn't have and can't buy." She paused. "I am done waiting for men with authority to come rescue me, Elias. I have the evidence. I have witnesses. I am going to stand on those steps, and I am going to say what happened, and this town is going to hear it, whether it wants to or not." Elias held her gaze. He did not argue. He picked up his hat. "All right," he said. "Let's go." Annie heard them from upstairs. She was already awake. She had been awake for an hour, lying beside Samuel and listening to the adult voices below with the focused attention of a child who had learned that adults' conversations contained the information that actually mattered. She heard her mother say she was done waiting. She heard Elias say all right. She shook Samuel's shoulder gently. "Time to get up, Bug." Samuel blinked at her. "Is it over?" "Not yet," she said. "But it's about to be." She helped him dress. She combed his hair with her fingers the way her mother did. She took his hand. When she came downstairs, her mother looked at her for a long moment, at this girl who had started everything, who had carried her brother and stolen the evidence, and looked a corrupt deputy in the eye and spoken with perfect clarity. Rebecca reached out and touched Annie's face with one hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Annie squeezed her mother's hand and let go. They came out onto the main street of Harlan Creek at 8:05, and the town noticed immediately. Not loudly, there was no commotion, no raised voices, just the particular silence that falls when people who have been going about their ordinary business register something extraordinary happening and stop what they're doing to watch. Martha walked on Rebecca's left. Elias walked at a distance of 3 paces behind, giving the women the front of it, because he understood instinctively that this moment needed to be led by Rebecca and not by him. Annie walked beside her mother, with Samuel's hand in hers. They moved down the middle of the street, with the straight-backed deliberation of people who had decided exactly where they were going and were not going to be redirected. Clara Briggs stepped off the boardwalk when she saw them coming. Then Hattie Morse. Then June Alderman with Nell Foster beside her and Nell's husband Tom just behind. They fell into step without a word being exchanged. It was the kind of solidarity that didn't require instruction, the kind that had been building for years and was simply waiting for the moment to show itself. By the time they reached the courthouse steps, there were 11 people in the group. Rebecca stopped at the base of the steps and turned to face the street. She did not go up the steps. She stood at ground level where anyone passing could see her face directly, and she waited. The town came to her. Not all of it. Not quickly, but one by one, people drifted over from the boardwalk, from the storefronts, from the edges of the street. The blacksmith left his forge. The woman from the laundry came to her doorway. A group of men outside the feed store turned and looked, and then slowly walked over. They had heard Crowley's version of events. Most of them had believed it, or told themselves they believed it, which was not the same thing, but was easier to live with. Now they looked at Rebecca Miles, standing in the morning light with her children beside her, and the marks still visible on her wrists, and something in the collective mind of Harlan Creek began to shift. Martha stepped forward. Her voice carried. "This woman's name is Rebecca Miles," she said. "She is a widow who has been managing her late husband's homestead alone for 2 years. 3 weeks ago, Silas Crowley presented her with a debt instrument bearing her signature. She did not sign it. Her husband's name is also on it. He has been dead for 2 years. She paused. "I have seen the document. I am prepared to testify to what I saw." A murmur went through the gathering crowd. Then the sheriff appeared. His name was Aldous Grant, and he was a man of medium ambition and maximum convenience. The kind of man who had not set out to be corrupt, but had arrived there through a series of small choices, each one easier than the one before, until he'd looked up one day and found himself standing in Silas Crowley's pocket, and couldn't quite remember how he'd gotten there. He pushed through the edge of the crowd, with 2 deputies behind him, and stopped when he saw how many people were gathered. His expression did its calculation visibly. "Mrs. Miles," he said, "I've got papers here requiring you to present your children to the court for a custody determination." "On what grounds?" Rebecca said. "On the grounds that you are in default of a legal debt obligation and that your ability to care for your children has been called into question." "By whom?" "By Mr. Crowley, who holds the debt." "Show me the original debt instrument," Rebecca said. "The one with my signature. I want to see it." The sheriff blinked. He had not expected this. He had expected a frightened woman, a weeping mother, the cooperative surrender of someone who believed the legal apparatus around her was legitimate because she didn't know it wasn't. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out. Rebecca took it. She unfolded it. She looked at it for precisely 4 seconds. "This is not my signature," she said, loudly, clearly, to the crowd and not to the sheriff. "I have never signed this document. This is a forgery." She held it up. "Look at the date. This debt was written before my husband was buried. Look at the signature. I have been writing my name for 29 years. This is not how I write it." She turned and handed it to Martha. Martha looked at it and looked up. "I've been receiving Rebecca Miles's letters and receipts for 2 years," Martha said. "I know her handwriting. This is not it." Tom Foster Nell's husband stepped forward from the edge of the group. He was a big, quiet man who had said nothing yet, but whose presence had been felt. "I knew Thomas Miles," he said. "I worked his fence line with him in the summer of 1878. The date on that debt says Thomas authorized it in March of 1879, 6 months before he died." He looked at the sheriff. "Thomas Miles told me that summer he had no debts and no intention of acquiring any. He was proud of that. He said it more than once." The crowd was very quiet now. The sheriff looked around him. He looked at the faces. Not all of them sympathetic, not all of them converted, but all of them watching, all of them listening, all of them remembering what they saw and heard. The mathematics of the situation were changing in front of him, and he was not fast enough to stop it. Then Silas Crowley arrived. He came from the direction of the land office with 2 men beside him and the particular stride of someone who had been informed of an inconvenient situation and had decided to resolve it by force of personality. He pushed into the edge of the gathered crowd, and people moved aside for him, the way they always had, by habit, by calculation, by the long conditioning of owing a man money. He stopped when he saw the crowd's size. He stopped again when he saw Rebecca's face. She was looking at him. She had been waiting for him. "Mr. Crowley," she said. Her voice was even and clear and absolutely without hesitation. "I have your ledger entries. I have your forged debt instruments. I have 3 years of documented coercion recorded in your own handwriting." She looked at him across the gathered townspeople. "And I want to know in front of every person standing here when exactly you decided that my husband was going to die." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Harlan Creek had ever heard. Crowley's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. The first was shock. The second was calculation. The third was the cold, flat mask of a man deciding to attack. "Sheriff," he said, "arrest her. Defamation. Slander." The sheriff did not move. "Sheriff," Crowley said again, sharper. "On what evidence?" a voice said from the back of the crowd. People turned. It was June Alderman's husband, who hadn't been part of the original group, who had simply walked over from the hardware store when he saw the gathering. He was asking a genuine question in the tone of a man who had decided he wanted an actual answer. "On the evidence that she held up a document and said it was forged," June's husband said. "That's not defamation. That's a claim." He looked at the sheriff. "If the document's legitimate, it'll survive scrutiny. If it won't survive scrutiny, we ought to know that." He looked around at the people near him. "Oughtn't we?" A murmur of assent moved through the crowd. Not unanimous, not thunderous, but real. The kind of sound a town makes when it's deciding which direction its conscience is going to face. Crowley turned to the sheriff. "Do your job," he said low and hard. The sheriff looked at Crowley. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Rebecca standing at the base of the courthouse steps with her children beside her, and the evidence in her hands, and 11 people around her, and an entire town watching. He made a choice. It wasn't a brave choice. It was a calculating choice, and the calculation had simply changed. But sometimes that was enough. "I'm going to need to see the original documents from both parties," he said. "Before any custody determination is made." He looked at Crowley. "That means today's proceeding is postponed pending review." Crowley's jaw tightened. "You work for me," he said, quiet enough that only the people directly around him could hear. "I work for this county," the sheriff said. It was probably the most honest thing he'd said in 2 years, and the effort of it showed on his face. Crowley looked at the crowd. He looked at Rebecca. He looked at Elias Boone, who had said nothing this entire time, who had stood 3 paces back with his arms loose at his sides, and his eyes steady, and his entire posture communicating that he was prepared to stand there all day if necessary. Crowley looked at him for a long moment. "You don't know what you've done," he said. "I think I do," Elias said. "Mandant." The wait for the marshal was the second hardest thing Rebecca had done in 3 years, after the first hardest thing, which was getting up every morning for those 3 years, and continuing. She sat on the courthouse steps with Samuel in her lap, and Annie pressed against her side. And the crowd around them thinned slowly as people drifted back to their ordinary business, changed in ways they might not fully understand until later. Martha sat beside her. Elias sat on the step below his back to them facing the street. Clara Briggs brought water. Hattie Morse brought biscuits from her kitchen still warm. Tom Foster stood at the edge of the steps and didn't leave, and his wife Nell stood beside him, and neither of them explained why they were staying, and nobody asked them to. Samuel ate 2 biscuits and fell asleep against Rebecca's arm. Annie watched the street. "He's still out there," she said. "Crowley. He went into the hotel, but he didn't leave town." "I know," Rebecca said. "He's waiting to see if the marshal actually comes." "So are we?" Rebecca said. Annie was quiet. Then, "What if they can't prove the thing about Papa? The date in the ledger?" Rebecca looked down at her daughter. She had been thinking about this since she'd seen that entry, the date written before her husband's death. The neat planned handwriting of a man who had been certain enough of the future to write it down in advance. She didn't know yet what she could prove. She knew what she believed. "One thing at a time," she said. It came out in Elias's cadence, and she was aware of that, and she did not mind. Elias glanced back at her when she said it. A small glance, quick, that might have meant nothing, or might have meant something. She was not ready yet to decide which. She looked back at the street. And then, at 11:30, at the far end of Harlan Creek's main road, a rider appeared. Then another. Then 3 more behind them, riding in the unhurried, purposeful way of men who carry federal authority and know it. Annie saw them first. She stood up from the step. "Mama," she said. Her voice was different from every other time she'd spoken that day. Not precise, not controlled, not older than her years. Just a child's voice, with a child's relief breaking through every careful layer she'd built. "I see them," Rebecca said. She stood. Samuel stirred and grabbed her hand in his sleep, and she held it. Martha stood beside her. Elias turned and looked down the road, and then looked back at Rebecca with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was close enough that the distinction barely mattered. The riders came into town, and Silas Crowley, watching from the hotel window, watched his certainty arrive at its end. The territorial marshal's name was Caleb Hurst, and he was not what Harlan Creek expected. He was not loud. He was not dramatic. He was a lean, gray-eyed man of about 50, who dismounted with the economy of someone who had ridden long distances for a long time and had stopped finding it remarkable. He handed his reins to one of his deputies without looking, straightened his coat, and looked at the people gathered on the courthouse steps with the measured attention of a man reading a situation before he said a single word about it. His eyes went to Rebecca first, then to the children, then to Martha, then to Elias, and on Elias they paused for just a moment, the recognition of one careful man for another. Then he looked at the courthouse door, then back at Rebecca. "Mrs. Miles," he said, "I'm Marshal Hurst. I received a telegraph from a Mr. Boone yesterday evening." He glanced at Elias. "That you?" "Yes, sir," Elias said. "The telegraph mentioned forged land documents and threatened miners." He looked at Rebecca. "I'd like to see what you have." Rebecca reached inside her coat. Her hands were steady. She had kept those papers dry through a rainstorm, and a night of waiting, and 2 hours on courthouse steps, and she held them out now with the composure of a woman who had decided somewhere between the smokehouse and this moment that she was done apologizing for taking up space. Hurst took the papers. He read them without expression. He turned pages. He stopped at the entry dated before Thomas Miles died. He read it a second time. He looked up. "Where's the original ledger?" he said. "Crowley's ranch office," Elias said. "West side of the main building, second drawer of the filing cabinet left side." Hurst looked at him. "You've been in that office." "I have," Elias said. He did not elaborate. Hurst looked back at the papers. He folded them with care and placed them inside his own coat. Then he turned to one of his deputies. "Ride to Crowley's ranch," he said. "Don't announce yourself. Secure the office and bring me the ledger and anything else in that filing cabinet. Don't let anyone in or out until I get there." He looked at the deputy until the deputy nodded and rode. Then he looked at Rebecca again. "Where is Silas Crowley right now?" "Hotel," Annie said. She had been standing quietly beside her mother holding Samuel's hand, but her voice came out clear and immediate because she had been tracking Crowley's location for the past 2 hours, and she knew precisely where he was. Hurst looked at the 8-year-old girl. Something shifted in his gray eyes, not surprise exactly, but a recognition of the specific kind of person he was looking at. "Thank you, miss," he said. Annie nodded, like it was nothing. Like she hadn't been awake for 36 hours carrying the weight of her family's survival on a frame that was still growing. Crowley came out of the hotel himself. He didn't wait to be summoned. That was the thing about men like Silas Crowley. They had enough intelligence to recognize when the ground was shifting, and their instinct was always to move toward the threat, rather than away from it, to control the narrative before someone else did. He came out with his hat straight and his shoulders back and the expression of a man who had been unjustly inconvenienced by lesser people and intended to say so. He stopped when he saw the marshal's badge, just for a second, just long enough for everyone watching to see it. Then he kept walking. "Marshal," he said. "Silas Crowley. I own the Double C Ranch and approximately 40% of the productive land in this county. I assume you've been contacted by some parties with a grievance." "I've been contacted by a grievance," Hurst said. "I'm looking at the evidence now. I have a deputy at your ranch office securing your records." The pause that followed was very small and very significant. The pause of a man whose internal structure has just received information it wasn't built to receive. "You don't have a warrant," Crowley said. "I have federal authority and probable cause," Hurst said. He said it the way a man states a fact about weather. No heat, no threat, just information. Which supersedes county jurisdiction when the crime involves fraudulent land claims and the endangerment of minors. He looked at Crowley with those gray eyes. "Do you want to tell me about the ledger entries, or would you prefer to wait until I've read the whole thing myself?" Crowley looked at the marshal. He looked at the crowd because there was still a crowd, people who had drifted back when the riders came in. People who had told themselves they were just passing by, but had not actually left. He looked at Rebecca on the courthouse steps. He looked at Martha beside her. He looked at Tom Foster and his wife and Clara Briggs, and all the ordinary faces of Harlan Creek that had been his audience for 4 years, and were now watching him from the wrong side of the story. He made one more calculation. Rebecca saw it happen on his face, the pivot from attack to procedure, from aggression to delay. "I'll be speaking with my lawyer," he said. "That's your right," Hearst said. "Don't leave town." The next 3 hours were the hardest kind of waiting, the kind where the outcome was close enough to feel, but not yet certain enough to hold. Rebecca sat inside the courthouse with the children, while Hearst's remaining deputies stood at the door. Martha brought food at noon that nobody ate much of. Samuel fell asleep again, which was the best thing he could have done, because sleep was still what he needed most, and he was still young enough to be able to find it in the middle of chaos. Annie did not sleep. She sat beside her mother and watched the door. "Are you scared?" Samuel had asked just before he drifted off. "No," Annie said. "You look scared." "I look like I'm paying attention," she said. "That's different." Samuel had accepted this and closed his eyes. Rebecca watched her daughter and thought about all the ways she had failed to protect her, all the mornings she had sent Annie to the kitchen to make breakfast, because she was too hollowed out by fear to get up herself, all the times Annie had learned things she shouldn't have had to learn, because Rebecca had been too small to stand between her children and the world's sharpness. She thought about the flour sack, the 11 miles, the desk in Crowley's office. "Annie," she said. The girl looked at her. "When this is over," Rebecca said, "I need you to know something." "What?" "You saved us," Rebecca said. "Not me, not Mr. Boone, not Martha." She held her daughter's eyes. "You picked up your brother and you walked. You took that paper. You knocked on a stranger's fence post and asked for the right thing." Her voice was steady because she had decided it would be. "I spent 3 years trying to keep us small enough that Crowley wouldn't bother crushing us. You decided to be big. You were 8 years old, and you were braver than I was." Annie was quiet for a long moment. Something moved through her face, the particular emotion of a child receiving words they have been starving for without knowing it. "You came into the rain," Annie said. "You went into his office." "Because you showed me how," Rebecca said. Annie leaned into her mother's shoulder. Not the controlled, watchful posture she'd held for days, just a child leaning into her mother and her mother's arm going around her, and both of them sitting in the quiet courthouse with the summer light coming through the window, and Samuel breathing slow beside them. Elias was outside. Rebecca knew because she could see his shadow through the frosted glass of the door, standing steady, not pacing, not leaving. Just there. She had been thinking about that, about the quality of his presence. About a man who crouched down to speak to an 8-year-old eye to eye, who handed over an oilskin in the rain without making it mean anything, who had stayed downstairs all night with the evidence pressed to his chest so she could sleep, who had stepped back at the courthouse steps so she could stand at the front of it. She had known men who helped in order to own. She had known men who protected in order to possess. She had been very carefully learning the difference for 3 years, and the difference mattered more than anything. She thought about what she'd said to Annie, about being brave enough to ask for the right thing. She thought about the cottonwood Thomas had planted, about the homestead that was still hers, about the fact that she had a life to rebuild and that rebuilding it alone was possible but not required. She was not ready to say any of this out loud yet. She filed it carefully for later. Hearst's deputy came back from the ranch at 2 in the afternoon. He had the ledger. Rebecca heard the commotion from inside and was at the door before Elias could knock. She came out into the afternoon light and looked at Hearst, who was standing at the base of the steps, holding the ledger open, his deputy beside him. "It matches your copies precisely," Hearst said. He looked up at her. "All of it. Every entry you copied is in here verbatim." He paused. "Including the entry dated before your husband's death." His voice shifted, even still professional, but something underneath it had hardened. "There are also entries here for a man named Benjamin Harmon, and a family named Castillo, and entries going back 4 years that suggest this has been operating as an organized land fraud scheme." He looked at her directly. "Mrs. Miles, I want you to understand what this means. This is federal territory now. This is not a county debt dispute. This is a federal crime." Rebecca held his gaze. "What about Thomas?" she said. "The date in the ledger." Hearst was quiet for a moment. "I can't tell you today what that date means in terms of what happened to your husband," he said. "That's a separate investigation, and I won't make you a promise I can't keep." He paused. "What I can tell you is that it will be investigated. I will personally ensure that." It was not the answer she had wanted. It was an honest answer, and she respected that more. "All right," she said. Silas Crowley was arrested at 3:14 in the afternoon on the main street of Harlan Creek, in front of approximately 40 people with his lawyer standing beside him and still talking. The lawyer stopped talking when Hearst read the charges aloud. There were 7 of them. Fraudulent land claims, falsification of legal instruments, coercion of a minor, unlawful restraint, wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and one charge that Hearst read last and quietly, which was suspicion of wrongful death pending investigation. Crowley said nothing when the cuffs went on. He had gone to a place past words, past the calculations, past the personality, past the 40% of the county certainty of a man who had believed his whole life that enough money made you untouchable. He stood on the main street of the town he thought he owned, and he said nothing. The sheriff. Sheriff Grant, who had made his small calculating choice on the courthouse steps that morning, stood to the side and watched. He was not arrested that day. He would be questioned. He would resign his office within the week. It would not be enough, and he would spend years knowing it wasn't enough, and that was perhaps its own form of justice. The crowd was quiet when Crowley was led away. Not celebratory, not relieved. Quiet in the way of people confronting the gap between what they had seen and what they had said, between what they had known and what they had chosen to believe. Martha Reed stood beside Rebecca and said nothing. She had said all she needed to say that morning. Tom Foster took off his hat. He stood with his hat in his hands and looked at Rebecca and nodded once. She nodded back. Annie watched Crowley go without expression. She stood straight and she watched him all the way until he was inside the marshal's custody and out of sight. And then she looked up at her mother. "Is it done?" she said. "The arrest is done," Rebecca said. "The rest will take time." "But we're safe." Rebecca looked down at her daughter, at this girl who had carried everything for 2 days and had not once let herself ask the question she'd just asked, because asking it meant admitting you needed the answer. "We're safe," Rebecca said. Annie nodded. That decisive nod she had, the one that meant she had received information and was filing it in the permanent record. Then she sat down on the courthouse steps and put her face in her hands and cried. Not the controlled 30 seconds she'd allowed herself in the cabin. The real thing. The full weight of 2 days of absolute terror finally releasing through the only exit available to it. Her shoulders shook, her breath came ragged. She made no attempt to stop it, and no attempt to hide it. Rebecca sat beside her. She put both arms around her daughter and held on. Samuel, who had come out to stand beside Elias on the steps, watched his sister cry for a moment. Then he walked over and sat on her other side and patted her back with the methodical seriousness of a 4-year-old who had decided this was the job available to him and he was going to do it well. Elias found Rebecca, an hour later, standing alone at the far end of the courthouse steps. The crowd had gone. Hearst's deputies were securing Crowley's paperwork with the county clerk. Martha had taken the children inside for water and shade. He stood a respectful distance from her without speaking. She spoke first. "He's going to ask," she said. "Hearst, about Thomas. He's going to dig into how my husband died, and I'm going to have to decide whether I want to know what he finds." "Do you?" Elias said. She was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "Even if it's terrible, even if I can't do anything about it now." She looked down at her hands. Thomas deserves to have someone ask the question. He deserves to have somebody refuse to let it go unmarked. She paused. He was a good man. He planted a cottonwood tree for people who came after him. Her voice caught once briefly and then steadied. He deserved better than what he got. "He did," Elias said. She looked at him. That direct look. "I'm going to rebuild the homestead," she said. "It's mine. It was always mine. I'm going to go back and plant the kitchen garden and fix the east fence and do all the things I stopped doing when Crowley made me feel like it wasn't worth the effort." "That sounds right," Elias said. "I'm going to do it alone," she said. "I need to do it alone for a while. I need to remember that I can." "I understand that," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Your fence line is 3 miles from my east boundary," she said. "It is," he agreed. "That's close enough to ask for help when I need it," she said, "and far enough to be my own." He held her gaze. "It is," he said again. And this time it meant something different, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. 2 weeks later, Annie Miles stopped hiding food under the floorboards. She had been doing it since the first winter after her father died, squirreling away hard biscuits and dried corn, a small secret store against the possibility that one day the food simply wouldn't be there. She had done it so automatically that she'd stopped thinking of it as fear, and had started thinking of it as just a thing she did the way you wore shoes or latched the door. She found the cash one morning while sweeping and stood looking at it for a long time. Then she picked it up and put it back in the pantry. All of it, in the proper place with the rest of the food where it was meant to be. She didn't tell her mother, she just did it, and then she went outside and stood in the morning light and felt the difference. Small, quiet interior of a person who has stopped bracing for the worst and has not yet decided what to do with the extra space. Samuel had started laughing again, not just smiling, laughing the unguarded, helpless kind that 4-year-olds produce when something strikes them as genuinely funny, which happened to Samuel approximately 40 times a day. He had laughed at a grasshopper that morning. He had laughed at the sound the well rope made. He had laughed at something Annie said that wasn't even that funny, and his laugh had been so whole and so ordinary that Rebecca had stood at the kitchen door and listened to it with the particular expression of a woman memorizing a sound. Elias came by on a Thursday with lumber for the east fence. He didn't ask. He showed up with the lumber in his wagon and said he had extra from a project that hadn't needed as much as he'd ordered, and Rebecca stood in the doorway and looked at him and the lumber and said, "You want coffee?" "If it's no trouble," he said. "It's no trouble," she said. He came inside. Samuel showed him the grasshopper he'd caught and kept in a jar. Elias examined it with complete seriousness and offered the opinion that it was one of the finer grasshoppers he had personally seen, which caused Samuel to laugh again in that helpless, total way. Annie watched from the corner of the room. She watched Elias listen to Samuel without looking at her mother, and she watched her mother pour 2 cups of coffee without looking at Elias, and she watched both of them not looking at each other, with the careful, patient quality of 2 people building something slow. She picked up her broom. She went back to sweeping. Outside on the east side of the homestead, where Thomas Miles had planted it 10 years ago, in a summer that had been dry and hard, and full of hope. The cottonwood stood in the July morning, with its leaves moving in the small, constant wind. Rebecca had planted sunflowers along the south side of the cabin door. She'd done it the first morning back, before she fixed the fence, before she even unpacked, and they were coming up now, green and straight, and reaching upward with the particular stubbornness of things that have been given good ground and intend to use it. There are men who build power by making others small. There are men who mistake fear for respect and compliance for love, who write other people's futures in their own handwriting and call it law. There are whole towns that learn to look away, because looking costs something, and the cost feels too high until the day someone stops looking away and makes it impossible for anyone to pretend they didn't see. Rebecca Miles had been made small for 3 years. She had let it happen not because she was weak, but because she was trying to protect her children in the only way she knew, and because the machinery of a corrupt place is very good at convincing you that the walls are load-bearing when they are not. It was her daughter who showed her the walls could come down. An 8-year-old girl with bleeding feet and a stolen piece of paper, and the absolute refusal to accept that her brother wasn't worth feeding. It was a quiet cowboy with a fence line and a long memory who showed her that help and ownership were not the same thing. And it was Rebecca herself standing on courthouse steps in the morning light with her children beside her, and 3 years of truth finally given a voice, who showed Harlan Creek that some debts are not financial at all. They are the debt a community owes to the people it failed to protect. And they come due whether you are ready to pay them or not.